The rope creaked like an old hymn sung on broken breath. Clara Mayfield's feet barely touched the dust. Her hands, bound behind her back, trembled with a grace she hadn't felt in years. Not since Caleb died. Not since the silence in her belly became too loud for the Mayfield name. Around her, the townsfolk watched in a hush that felt holier than any church sermon. Not a single soul moved to stop it. Not the sheriff. Not the preacher. Not even her own blood. They didn't hang her to kill her. No, this was worse. They lifted her before the whole town to show what became of a woman who couldn't do the one thing God made her for. The noose wasn't tied to break her neck. Just enough to scrape her breath away. Just enough to brand her shame into the wind. Silas Mayfield, Caleb's older brother, stood with his boots planted firm and his hat pulled low, quoting scripture in that fire and ash voice of his. "Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire," he growled. And the crowd murmured amen because it felt safer than silence. Clara's breath came shallow. Her hair clung to her cheeks like willow branches after rain. Her dress, Caleb's favorite blue, billowed slightly in the dry wind. She didn't fight, hadn't screamed. That had been her sin all along. She endured too quietly for a world that only believed in loud pain. She remembered the moment the doctor told her the third one hadn't taken, the way Caleb had left the room before the words finished falling. How his mother refused to touch her after that, like barrenness could spread by skin. How the fourth and fifth miscarriages came like thieves in the night, stealing not just blood but hope. The Mayfields wanted a boy, a strong name to carry the cattle brand, a child to rise at dawn and tame the land. Clara gave them graves and apologies. Then Caleb died, trampled under a spooked herd near the riverbed, his scream lost in the thunder of hooves. The family didn't cry long. They buried him fast and turned their blame like rifles toward her. Sheriff Amos Finch had tried to talk them down from it for an afternoon. Then he folded like weak timber. "A public humbling," he muttered, unable to look Clara in the eye. "It'll keep the peace." Peace. That was what they called it, when a woman is strung up and left to choke on her own silence, while the preacher weeps and the sun sets red behind the gallows. When they cut her down, she didn't fall. Her knees bent, but she stayed upright. That was what broke them. Not her cries. She gave them none, but her refusal to break where they wanted her to. Silas spat near her feet. "God has judged you, Clara Mayfield. You are cast out." She looked up at him, her lips split, her eyes ringed in purple shadow, and said nothing. That silence was louder than fire. She stumbled to the town like a ghost they couldn't quite exorcise. The streets cleared as she passed. Mrs. Langston, the oldest tongue in town, clutched her prayer book and muttered, "It would have been kinder to let her swing." Clara reached the edge of town as the sun dipped fully behind the ridges. Her breath was ragged. The bruises around her throat throbbed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Her dress hung crooked. Her hands, once skilled in sewing, in gathering wildflowers, now shook like autumn leaves. She collapsed near a watering trough. The earth felt colder than the air. Her vision flickered between dust and stars. Boots approached. Heavy, steady, not urgent, just present. A man knelt beside her, rough coat brushing her arm. He didn't touch her at first, just looked, then wordlessly. He slid his coat from his shoulders and laid it over her like a blanket. He had eyes the color of storm-brewed coffee and a face carved by weather. His jaw was lined with unshaven grit, his lips firm and quiet. He said nothing, asked nothing, just lifted her like a bundle of broken sticks and carried her away. When she opened her eyes again, the world smelled of wood smoke and saddle leather. She lay on a narrow bed in a one-room cabin, where the air moved soft and careful. A fire crackled low. The wind outside danced with dry leaves. She stirred, wincing. A low voice spoke near the hearth. "Coffee's on." She blinked. A silhouette moved slowly. Tall, broad-shouldered, deliberate. He turned only slightly. "You can rest. Ain't no one gonna find you here." She tried to sit, her throat flaring like rawhide. "Where?" "You're on my land," he said. "Name's Jed Callahan. Don't ask how I found you. Just know you were about to die where you lay." His voice was deep but quiet, like rain in the canyon. She nodded once and closed her eyes. When next she woke, the fire was still going, and a tin mug sat on the table beside her. Beside it, a note. "Stay. Heal. Coffee's hot." She didn't remember falling asleep again. The days blurred. She learned that Jed didn't talk much. His silence wasn't cold, though. It was the kind that gave room to breathe. He moved like a man used to walking alone, like he didn't expect anyone to follow, but didn't mind when they did. He lived simple. 2 horses, 3 chickens, a windmill that creaked in rhythm with the sun. He had a scar on his right hand, and cooked eggs with the kind of focus that made you feel like breakfast mattered. Clara didn't ask questions. She didn't want to know why he lived so far out, why he watched the horizon like it owed him a memory, why he hadn't taken her back to town. Maybe she knew. Maybe he saw something in her that mirrored whatever loneliness he'd buried under floorboards. On the 5th morning, she spoke first. "You gonna ask what I did?" Jed didn't look up from the wood. He was splitting. "Ain't my place. They hanged me. I saw. They said I failed God." Jed set the axe down, leaned against the chopping block. "Some folks speak for God too easy. Makes me think they ain't listening close enough." She didn't smile, not quite, but her breath eased. That evening, he brought her a shawl he found in an old trunk. It was rough wool, smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco. She accepted it with both hands. "Thank you. Winter comes early out here," he said. "Cold don't wait on no one." Outside, the first snow flurried like ash from the sky. One night, she asked if she could feed the chickens. He nodded. Next day, she swept the porch. He didn't comment, but when he repaired the back gate, he left a hammer and a box of nails nearby, as if he trusted she might need them. That was how they spoke, through gestures, not declarations. She watched the men tack with thick fingers that had seen war or heartbreak. Maybe both. He watched her hum to herself while stirring beans, as if sound itself had returned to her voice. In town, the stories began to shift. Mrs. Langston whispered, "She's holed up with Callahan. Devil's pair, those two." Sheriff Finch sighed. "If she's with Jed, she's safer than she ever was." Silas Mayfield said nothing, but he sharpened his knife every morning, as if waiting for a moment only he could see. Back on the ranch, Clara didn't know any of that. She only knew that every day she woke to silence that didn't accuse her, that sometimes Jed left her the last biscuit, and once he fixed a hole in her boot without telling her. One night by the fire, she stared into the flames and said, "I wanted to name him Jonah." The second one, he made it almost 5 months. Jed didn't speak, just reached for the fire poker, nudged a log, and said softly, "Strong name." The fire cracked, and something inside her opened. She told him everything, not all at once, just little pieces, like breadcrumbs left on a trail back to herself. And Jed listened, like it mattered. That night, she didn't dream of ropes. She dreamt of wild horses and soft thunder, and the smell of wood smoke wrapped around her like a promise. Morning came slow, warm, and golden. She stepped outside with her shawl and breathed in the wind. Jed stood by the fence, staring east. He turned when he heard her, and for the first time he smiled. Just a little, but it was enough to carry her through the day. Clara Mayfield wasn't whole yet, but she was not alone. And in a world that had once left her dangling between life and shame, that was more than she'd ever dare to hope. The morning light slipped slow across the wooden floor, golden and forgiving. Clara stood at the cabin's threshold with bare feet and a tin mug cradled in her palms, the warmth bleeding into fingers still sore from days spent stitching, scrubbing, mending. She didn't move much, just breathed, watching how the mist curled over the pastures like a secret the earth hadn't decided to share. Jed was already out among the cattle, his silhouette cutting against the pale sky, like a line drawn by steadier hands than hers. She'd woken to his absence, but the coffee had been there, per usual, still hot. He never said good morning, never knocked at her door, but she knew when he was near. Jed's presence wasn't loud. It was a hush, like the world itself listened when he passed. She had never known a man who took up so much space in silence. Clara stepped out into the chill and pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. The path to the corral had become familiar now. Each rock, each bend in the fence post, each knothole in the gate, little landmarks that grounded her in this strange, sacred routine. It had been just under 2 weeks since Jed brought her here, and though the bruises had faded from her neck, she still reached for them in the dark, surprised to find smooth skin. Jed nodded as she approached, tipping his hat but saying nothing. His horse, a gray mare named Whistle, snorted once and turned away, unimpressed. "You train him?" Clara asked. Jed squinted toward the animal, wiping sweat off his brow with a dirt-smeared sleeve. "More like convince them. Takes less force, more patience." "I reckon people ain't too different," she murmured. He didn't respond, but the corner of his mouth twitched. For Jed, it was practically a laugh. Later that day, Clara baked cornbread. She found the supplies tucked away in the old pantry: flour, cornmeal, a half-used tin of baking powder, and a folded recipe card yellowed with time. She didn't ask if she could. She just did, the way one hums a tune without thinking. The smell filled the cabin slowly, curling into corners that hadn't known comfort in years. When Jed came in from the field, his boots tracked dry mud, but he paused just inside the door, sniffed the air. He didn't compliment her, didn't make a sound, but he sat down and ate 3 pieces without pausing, and when he rose again, he said, "I'll be out by the west fence if you need me." It wasn't thanks, but it was enough. That evening, Clara walked the edge of the property alone. The wind picked up as dusk bled into night, and the clouds bunched thick over the moon. She passed a split-rail fence where wildflowers grew between stones, and where the grass didn't quite cover the bones of something buried long ago. She paused there, sensing without knowing. It wasn't until she circled back toward the barn that she saw the graves. 3 small wooden markers, each worn smooth by time and rain. No names, just the faint shape of hands that had carved them. Clara felt a heaviness pressed low in her chest. She didn't need to ask. She knew grief when she saw its quiet house. Jed didn't mention them. But the next morning, he left her a pair of gloves by the barn door. They were too big but warm, and the stitching was done with care. They never spoke about the past. Not hers, not his. But their hands learned each other before their voices did. He taught her how to mend a broken saddle strap, how to test a fence wire by sound. She showed him how to knead dough without bruising it, how to catch rainwater clean from a roof. In each act, they said something they hadn't yet found words for. Once, after repairing a chicken coop damaged by a fox, Clara sat with her back against the wall of the barn, sweat cooling on her brow. Jed joined her, setting down a hammer beside him. "They still talk about me in town?" she asked, voice low. "Some do. Bad. Mostly." Clara picked at a splinter on her skirt. "I figured." He took a long breath, staring out toward the hills. "Folk don't like what they don't understand. Easier call it cursed than call it unfair." "You think I'm cursed?" "No. You think it was unfair? He didn't answer right away. Then, I think sometimes the world gives us more sorrow than we got pockets to carry it in. Clara turned her face toward him. His eyes did meet hers, but they didn't look away either. That night, she dreamed of a house with no doors, just windows. And through every pane, she saw a different version of herself, child, bride, widow, ghost. She woke with tears on her cheeks and her hands clenched tight. The next morning, a visitor came. Mrs. Prue Langston, clad in dark green wool and gossip, rolled up in her buggy like judgment given form. Clara watched on the porch as the woman tied her horse and approached with a wicker basket covered in a checker cloth. Jed met her halfway. "Morning, Jedediah," Mrs. Langston cooed, her voice sharp as vinegar. "Heard you taken in the Mayfield widow. Folks in town are mighty concerned." Jed said nothing. "I just thought I'd bring a few things. Biscuits. A little marmalade. Nothing sinful." She gave a tight smile. "Poor thing's been through quite the ordeal. Of course, a man living alone. Folks wonder what kind of arrangement's been struck." Jed held the basket between them without taking it. "You done?" The smile faded. "I beg your pardon?" "You done, Prue?" His tone was even, calm. "She don't need your pity. Or your poison. And I sure don't need your marmalade." Mrs. Langston's face colored. She left the basket on the ground and huffed back to her buggy without another word. Clara stayed seated, hands clasped in her lap. She hadn't realized how tightly her heart was gripping until Jed returned and set the basket on the steps without comment. "She's wrong," Clara whispered. Jed sat beside her. "She's afraid. Afraid her world ain't as clean as she likes to think." "I'm not afraid," Clara said. "I know." She looked out toward the hills. "I wish I could say I don't care what they think. But I do." Jed didn't try to fix it, just handed her the basket. "You want a biscuit?" She nodded. "Maybe just one." A storm rolled in that afternoon. Thunder low and steady, not violent. More like the sky was remembering something it hadn't spoken in years. Clara stood on the porch and let the wind push her hair back. Let the rain start to wet her shawl. Jed joined her, and they stood side by side, not talking, not touching, just being. The world smelled of sage and earth and new chances. Later that week, Jed saddled 2 horses. "You ride?" he asked. "It's been years." Time to remember, then. He helped her mount a chestnut gelding named Pharaoh, and they rode slow, letting the rhythm return to her bones. She didn't smile right away, but by the time they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, she was laughing, softly, surprised, like laughter was something she misplaced long ago and suddenly found tucked inside herself. Jed pointed to the horizon. "Storm broke the drought. Wild grass will grow fast now. Maybe this year will be different." Clara didn't answer, just stared at the land below. It spread wide and golden, unbothered by memory. "I never wanted a boy," she said suddenly. "Not the way they did." Jed looked at her, waiting. "I want a child who'd sing, who'd learn flowers before letters, who'd ask why the sky changes color at dusk." "And did you?" "I didn't get to find out." They rode home in silence, but it wasn't heavy, just full. That night, while drying dishes, Clara found an old music box tucked in a drawer. It was chipped and half rusted, but when she turned the crank, it played a lullaby that made her throat ache. Jed walked in and paused at the sound. He looked at the box, then at her. "I didn't know it still worked," he said. "It does." She didn't ask whose it had been. He didn't offer. But as the notes danced between them, something settled. The next day, Clara began planting. She found a patch of soft ground near the barn and knelt with seeds she'd taken from the edge of the pantry. Squash, beans, a few herbs. Her hands were unsteady at first, But soon emotion became memory. Jed stood by the fence, watching. Didn't know you had a garden in you. I didn't either. Until now. As she pressed the last seed into the earth, the wind caught her hair. She looked up at Jed. Things might still grow, you think? He nodded once, given time, and quiet. And for the first time in her life, she believed that might be true. The bell tolled slow, a hollow clang rolling over the valley like an old sorrow stirred awake. From the cabin's porch, Clara heard it, knew what it meant. Town market day. The clang always came 3 times in a row, as if warning the faithful and reminding the forgotten. She wiped her hands on her apron, gaze fixed on the dust trails curling above the distant hills. Jed leaned against the doorframe behind her, arms folded. You sure you want to go? No, she said, but I need to. It had been nearly a month since she stepped foot in town. Since the hanging, since the rope, since the crowd of faces that had blurred together in judgment. But something inside her was changing, like frost thaw in early spring. And she needed to know if the world outside the ranch had thawed even a little too. They rode in silence, the wind at their backs, the horses moving steady, the land shifting around them like it remembered things they didn't want to name. Clara's heart beat too loud. She kept her hands folded in her lap as they passed familiar markers. The old tree stump where boys used to tie frogs to fireworks. The broken fence post where a younger version of her had once watched the sky and dreamed of more. By the time the town came into view, her chest felt tight with old ghosts. Market day was always noisy. Barrels rolled, chickens clucked, boots scuffed wooden boards, and voices layered over each other like poorly stacked crates. But when Clara and Jed rode in, everything slowed. Not stopped, just hesitated. Heads turned, conversations paused, and then the world resumed, only quieter. Clara dismounted with stiff legs. Her steps were careful, like walking through water. Jed stayed close but didn't hover. His presence was a comfort, a silent wall between her and whatever venom still lingered. Inside the general store, Clara moved along the shelves with practiced restraint. Soap, matches, flour, thread. Her fingers hovered over a small jar of peppermint oil and drifted away. It was a necessity. She could live without it. Behind the counter, old Mr. Garrett avoided her eyes. He rang up the goods without comment. His hands were trembling. She noticed. She said nothing. As she stepped out, someone spat near her boots. Clara paused. A boy, 14, maybe 15, stood across the boardwalk, face twisted with something too old for his age. He didn't say anything, just spat again, then turned and walked off, boots thudding louder than necessary. Jed was already beside her. You okay? She nodded. He's just a child. Children carry the words they hear at home. Clara's voice didn't waver. Then I hope his home breaks before he grows into the man they want him to be. They walked to the feed store, past the church where Pastor Alden stood beside the doors, arms folded, lips pressed. He didn't offer a greeting, but Sheriff Amos Finch did. He tipped his hat, his voice low. Miss Mayfield. Clara looked at him carefully. Sheriff. He scratched at his mustache, couldn't quite meet her gaze. Town's quieter these days. I doubt that. He sighed. You need anything, Jed knows where to find me. She inclined her head and moved on. Her stomach churned like river mud. Later, at the market stall, Clara picked out apples with slow, measured motions. Her fingers brushed a bruised one. She set it aside. Surprised you came back, a voice said from behind. She turned. Silas Mayfield stood 10 paces off. His eyes were hard as railroad nails, his mouth drawn tight. He wore a black coat, and the same wide hat he'd worn the day they hoisted her up. His boots were clean. Clara said nothing. You've got gall showing your face here. Jed took one step forward, but Clara's hand found his forearm, not to hold him back, but to steady herself. I buried my brother, Silas said, and still you live. No sun, no air, just shame walking around like it deserves sunlight. I didn't kill Caleb, Clara said evenly, and I didn't deserve what you did. Silas's face twitched. You are barren. That's judgment enough. I am not barren, she whispered. I was broken and grieving, and still am, but I'm not yours to judge anymore. Silas's mouth opened, but Jed stepped between them. His voice was low but firm. You said your piece. Now let her breathe. You're welcome to the devil's leavings, Silas snapped, turning on his heel. Careful, Jed said, his tone sharpening. You're talking to a man who stopped caring what others thought a long time ago. Silas didn't look back. The air felt heavier after that. The walk home was quieter, even by their standards. When they reached the cabin, Clara went straight to the small shelf by the window. She pulled down a folded length of blue fabric, her old dress, the one she'd worn the day they hung her. She spread it across the table, ran her fingers over the frayed neckline, the torn sleeve, the dust-bleached hem. Jed entered behind her, paused. Why keep it? Because I need to see what I survived. That evening, they didn't eat much. The stew went cold in the bowls. Clara sat by the fire with a needle and thread, sewing up the old dress. She didn't know if she'd wear it again. That wasn't the point. She needed her hands to move, needed her memory to hurt a little less. Jed pulled out an old harmonica from the drawer. He didn't play, just looked at it for a long while, then set it on the windowsill and left it there. When the sun rose again, Clara was already outside. She found a flat patch of earth near the side of the barn and knelt, with a small trowel in quiet resolve. She began digging. Jed watched from a distance. What are you planting? He asked after some time. Roses, she said. He approached slowly. That's stubborn ground. I know. Hard to bloom here. I know. He didn't argue, just knelt beside her and started helping. That night, after the soil had been turned and the seeds pressed in deep, Clara sat on the porch and stared at the stars. Jed joined her, a mug of warm cider in his hand. They didn't speak for a long while. I saw your wife's grave, Clara said softly. Jed nodded. Her name was Mercy. She didn't have children? No. We tried. What happened? She died in winter. Fever. I buried her on Christmas morning. Clara breathed out slowly. And yet you stayed kind. Jed turned his head. Didn't feel like kindness. Just didn't want to pass the pain forward. I think she'd be proud of that. He didn't respond, but the silence between them grew softer. The next day, a letter came. Sheriff Finch rode up, hat in hand. Clara met him at the gate. Got something from the county judge, he said. Silas filed for inheritance dispute. He wants the Mayfield land back. Says you forfeited all rights when you failed to bear heirs. Clara took the letter, without flinching. I never wanted the land. Finch shifted uncomfortably. Still, you're named in Caleb's will. It'll be a hearing. Nothing violent, but he looked up. You'll be in the same room again. Let him speak, she said. I have truth, and that's enough now. She read the letter alone on the porch, eyes skimming over legal terms and tired threats. When Jed came by with a pail of water, she folded it carefully and handed it to him. Keep it, she said. I don't need to read it again. In the following days, Clara changed, not in a way the eye could immediately see, but in the steadiness of her stride, in the way she began humming again while brushing the horse, in the way she braided her hair without trembling fingers. Jed noticed, but he didn't say so. Instead, he fixed the railing on the porch, left a wrapped bar of peppermint soap beside her wash basin, and began carving a small wooden horse without explanation. On the morning of the hearing, Clara dressed in the blue again, cleaned, repaired, fitted tight around her ribs but firm. She braided her hair and tied it with twine. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the basin and whispered, "You survived." Jed rode with her to the courthouse. Inside, the room was too warm. Silas sat with two men in coats finer than a soul. The judge wore wire spectacles and asked questions with a voice that sounded bored. Silas spoke of family honor, of land rights, of wounds and legacies. When it was her turn, Clara stood. She didn't raise her voice, didn't cry. She said, "I was loved, and I loved back. I carried children and buried them. That doesn't make me unworthy. That makes me human." The judge listened. Silas fumed. Jed never took his eyes off her. The ruling wouldn't come for weeks. But as they rode home under a lavender dusk, Clara felt no dread. Back at the cabin, the roses had started to sprout, and for the first time since the rope tightened around her neck, Clara Mayfield smiled without flinching. The earth was softer than expected, damp with spring thaw and rich with the dark promise of roots. Clara knelt by the small grave with a single word, mercy, etched into stone, and pressed the sapling into place, her fingers curling the dirt with quiet reverence. She whispered, not for the dead, but for the living. She deserved flowers. I'll make sure she gets them now. From the porch, Jed watched. His arms were folded across his chest, not in judgment, but in something quieter, a holding. He didn't move to help. He knew the difference between a task and a ritual. The wind stirred the leaves, and Clara smoothed the soil flat. She did not pray. Her faith had long ago become something quieter than God and louder than Scripture. It lived in the way she touched things, the way she stayed. The ranch no longer felt borrowed. The walls creaked like old friends. The kitchen sang with warmth. The mornings began with coffee and ended with tired feet. And somewhere in the middle, their silences became the kind that hold meaning instead of distance. Jed had begun building, quietly as always, a new room off the West End. He didn't say it was for her, but the walls told her plainly. Clara said nothing, but left a folded quilt near the doorway. He used it the next night. Her hair had grown long again. She wore it loose some mornings. Jed didn't say anything when he noticed, but his eyes lingered a little longer. She hummed when tending sheep now, the same tune every time, one Jed didn't recognize, but came to expect. She found an old baby blanket in the back of a cedar chest, packed tight beneath yellowed letters and brittle lace. It was hand-stitched blue and cream, edges frayed by time. She didn't cry. She just folded it and set it in the drawer of the room Jed was building. They never spoke of children, not after what had come before, but the silence between them held space now, not emptiness, possibility. One morning, Sheriff Finch arrived, dust thick on his boots and hat in his hand. "Silas," he said, voice tight, "he's missing." Clara felt something icy crawl up her spine. Jed didn't move. "People are talking," the sheriff added. "Say you might have had cause." Jed met his eyes. "And what do you say?" "I say it's probably better if you both keep to yourselves a while." Jed nodded once. Clara watched Finch ride off. His shoulders hunched as if the wind itself had turned against him. That night, she found Jed out by the fence line, sharpening a blade he hadn't used in months. "Did you?" she began. He looked up, steel paused mid-motion. Only what needed killing. Her breath caught, not in fear, in understanding. He stood, brushed his hands clean. But not this time. The moonlight washed his face in pale resolve. Clara nodded. "I believe you." But the dreams returned that night. Clara awoke choking on remembered rope, on the echo of Silas's voice hissing scripture like venom. Her fingers clawed the quilt, her breath shallow. Jed was already there, pulling her close, no questions, just arms like anchors and a chest that rose steady beneath her cheek. He didn't speak. She didn't need him to. In spring, the roses she planted bloomed, red and wild. The sapling beside Mercy's grave pushed new leaves skyward. And Clara, brushing her fingers across the bloom, felt a strange flutter low in her belly. At first, she thought it was just the wind. Then the sickness came, morning after morning. Jed noticed before she did. "You ain't been eating much," he said one afternoon, watching her poke at supper with a frown. "Food's wrong," she murmured. "You're glowing strange." She blinked. "Glowing?" He shrugged, like the sky before it storms. She pressed a hand to her stomach. Something fluttered again, quieter this time, like a secret. The doctor came 2 days later, a grim-faced man who never stayed long. "You're with child," he said, blinking like he didn't quite believe it, far long enough to know it's no false hope. Clara sat very still. Jed placed his hand over hers and didn't speak. The town split like a cracked dish. Some called it a miracle. Others called it manipulation. Mrs. Langston said Clara had seduced sin into her belly. The preacher muttered about trials and deceit. But no one came up the hill, not after the sheriff closed the gate himself. Because Silas's body had washed up in the river, face battered beyond recognition, boots missing, pockets empty. The sheriff said it was likely an accident. The current had been strong. A slip, a punishment, perhaps from a higher power. But in town, people whispered. Some said Jed had done it. Others said Clara's child had cursed him from the womb. The truth floated somewhere between silence and soil. Clara didn't ask Jed again. Some truths didn't need confirming. Some devils buried themselves, and she'd already danced with too many ghosts. The baby grew. Her belly rose like a small hill under her apron, quiet and unassuming. Jed built a cradle with callous hands and carved a star into the headboard. "I didn't know what to carve," he said one night. "A star is good," she replied. "Something that stays when everything else moves." Mrs. Langston came that summer. Uninvited like rot, she stood at the edge of the porch, dressed in morning black, though no one had died recently. Her eyes latched onto Clara's belly with something like hunger. "You'll raise another curse," she said softly. Clara stood tall. "No, I'll raise mercy." The older woman's face twitched. "This child won't fix what you are." Clara smiled, slow and quiet. "I'm not broken, just born again of better things." Mrs. Langston left without another word. Jed found Clara sitting beside the rose bush later that evening, hands folded over her belly, eyes turned to dusk. "They'll never stop talking," he said gently. "I know. They don't matter. They never did." The baby kicked then, hard. Clara gasped and took Jed's hand, pressing it to her belly. He froze. His mouth parted, and for once, words failed him. "There," she whispered. "That's ours." The stars came out above them like sparks. The wind carried no sermons now, only the rustle of leaves and the hum of new beginnings. When the baby came, screaming, wet, beautiful, it was a girl. They named her Mercy, not for forgetting, but for remembering, gently. Sheriff Finch brought a casserole. Mrs. Langston stayed away. No one burned Clara again. Instead, they watched as she walked through town with her daughter cradled tight and Jed's arm around her waist. Some whispered, others nodded, but no one dared spit. Time passed. The child grew. Clara's hair went silver at the temples. Jed built another barn. The roses bloomed every spring. The sapling became a tree, and at its base, 2 names were carved side by side. Mercy, Clara, The third, Jed, was added later. Sometimes at dusk, Claire would sit by the fire and tell her daughter's story, not of hangings or hate, but of healing, of soil and silence, of a man who laid his hand on her belly and didn't ask what had come before, only what might grow next. If you're listening, and you've ever felt like your worth was measured in someone else's eyes, know this: you are not the shame they gave you. You are the dust that rose. You are the fire that stayed, not to burn, but to warm the ones who come after. Some names are burned into the earth. Others are carved into hearts. And some, like Clara Mayfield's, are written in dust, only to rise again with the wind. If you're listening, and you've ever felt like your worth was measured in someone else's eyes, know this: you are not the shame they gave you. You are the soil that blooms when no one's watching. And sometimes, if you're lucky, someone will kneel beside your ruin and whisper, "Mine,